The Atlantic Ocean, 1942. A German U-boat, crippled by depth charges, sinks deeper into the icy waters. The hull creaks under the immense pressure, its crew huddled in the dim light of their claustrophobic quarters. Outside, the relentless pounding of British depth charges reverberates through the water. The situation is dire. The crew, once the hunters of the deep, now face the cold reality of being hunted. Every second feels like an eternity. On the surface, a British destroyer hovers above the wrecked U-boat. The crew aboard the destroyer prepares for the final blow, certain the U-boat will soon be a sunken tomb. But then, a radio call shatters the silence. The decision is made to rescue the German sailors. In the midst of a brutal war, a moment of humanity emerges from the depths of the ocean. The German crew, astonished by the mercy shown by their enemies, realize that their captors, once the embodiment of everything they fought against, are offering them life instead of death. In the chilling waters of the Atlantic, an act of compassion will soon bridge the chasm between mortal enemies. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, stretching from the first shots fired in 1939 to the final surrender in 1945. For Britain, this was a war fought on the ocean, as the survival of the nation depended on its ability to keep supply lines open across the Atlantic. At the heart of the struggle were the German U-boat submarines that had been identified early on by Adolf Hitler as a critical weapon in his strategy to cut Britain off from its vital resources and break its will to fight. By 1940, the Kriegsmarine's fleet of U-boats had grown significantly in number and capability. These submarines, capable of submerging to avoid detection, were deadly predators in the vast expanse of the Atlantic. Their primary goal was to destroy British convoys, merchant ships that carried the lifeblood of the Empire. Food, fuel, munitions, and reinforcements from the United States and Canada. The German High Command believed that the destruction of Britain's merchant fleet would force the nation into submission. In the early years of the war, U-boats proved devastatingly effective. They stalked convoys, often emerging from the depths to strike without warning, sinking dozens of ships at a time. The Allies suffered catastrophic losses, and at the height of the U-boat threat in 1942, the tide of the war in the Atlantic appeared to favor the Germans, as they sank ships faster than the Allies could replace them. To many, it seemed that the U-boat menace would soon bring Britain to its knees. But the Royal Navy and the Allied forces were not without their own countermeasures. The struggle was fierce, as U-boats and Allied ships clashed repeatedly in the cold waters of the Atlantic. For the German sailors aboard these submarines, the war was one of constant fear and high stakes. Even as they wreaked havoc on British convoys, they knew that each mission brought them closer to a potential violent death beneath the waves. For the German U-boat crews, the war in the Atlantic was both a mission and a personal ordeal. Trained as elite sailors, they were the epitome of Nazi Germany's naval power, feared and respected for their deadly effectiveness. The U-boats, sleek and silent, prowled the deep waters, striking with precision and disappearing into the abyss. These sailors were fully aware of the risks that came with their role. The life of a U-boat crew member was one of extreme hardship and constant danger. Living conditions aboard the submarines were cramped and uncomfortable, with little ventilation, minimal privacy, and barely enough space to move. The crew was forced to endure long patrols, sometimes for weeks or months, with limited contact with the outside world. The relentless pressure of being underwater, combined with the fear of attack from Allied warships or aircraft, made every day a battle for survival. The constant threat of death loomed large for U-boat crews. Each mission was fraught with peril, as they faced the very real possibility of being destroyed by depth charges, torpedoes, or even being sunk by Allied aircraft. The survival rate of U-boat crews was low, and many submariners knew that their chances of making it through the war alive were slim. The psychological toll of this uncertainty was immense, leading to high levels of anxiety and tension aboard the boats. But perhaps the most pressing fear was the fear of capture. While U-boat crews had wreaked havoc on Allied merchant shipping, the British, in particular, were known for their fierce tactics against German submarines. Prisoners taken by the Allies could expect long internment and harsh treatment, yet, despite these fears, many German U-boat sailors believed that their war was one of honor and duty, and in their minds they were engaged in a fight for their country's survival. For these sailors, the odds were stacked against them. They were trained to believe that the Allies' strength lay in their numbers and their technological superiority. The U-boats were their weapon of choice, but even with their technological edge, many knew they were outnumbered and eventually outgunned. The constant threat of destruction was ever present, and the prospect of becoming another casualty in the Battle of the Atlantic was a constant reality. For the men aboard the German U-boats, each mission in the icy expanse of the Atlantic was a test of endurance and resolve. Beneath the surface, in cramped quarters that offered little room for movement or comfort, the psychological strain was immense. These submarines were designed for stealth and precision, but they came at a high human cost. The crews, confined in near-total darkness, endured the constant noise of the engines, the hum of sonar, and the ever-present tension of being hunted. The conditions were harsh. Fresh water was scarce, food was often insufficient, and the air grew thick with the smell of diesel and sweat. The claustrophobic environment only amplified the sense of isolation and fear. The crew members lived in a state of heightened alertness, knowing that a single misstep could lead to death. The dangers of attack by Allied ships or aircraft loomed large. In these dire conditions, many U-boat sailors formed a bond stronger than the typical military camaraderie. It was a shared sense of existential uncertainty. Despite the mission they had been given, many began to question whether survival was even possible. The constant strain of combat, coupled with the harsh realities of submarine life, created a psychological toll that was difficult to bear. For these men, the very nature of their war was one that pushed the boundaries of endurance and mental resilience. As the German U-boats prowled the Atlantic, seeking to strangle Britain's supply lines, the Royal Navy and its allies faced an enormous challenge. The U-boat threat had already inflicted heavy losses on Allied shipping, and Britain's very survival depended on its ability to combat this silent menace beneath the waves. To meet this challenge, British naval commanders and sailors developed a series of innovative tactics designed to counter the U-boat threat. At the forefront of these efforts was the use of convoy systems. Britain, recognizing the vulnerability of unprotected merchant ships, organized convoys of merchant vessels escorted by warships and aircraft. This strategy allowed for greater protection against U-boat attacks, though it was by no means foolproof. U-boats, often working in groups, would attempt to break through these defenses and attack the convoys at night or in poor visibility. The Royal Navy also made extensive use of depth charges, explosive devices designed to target submarines at depth. Depth charges were launched from ships, exploding in the water around suspected U-boat locations. British sailors, many of whom had little experience with submarine warfare, had to learn quickly the intricate tactics of tracking, detecting, and sinking these elusive targets. The British also relied on newly developed technologies like radar and sonar. These technological advances, combined with the growing tactical proficiency of British sailors, allowed the Royal Navy to gradually turn the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. What had seemed like an insurmountable threat began to show signs of vulnerability. The battle beneath the waves during the Battle of the Atlantic was one not just of courage and resilience, but of technology. The Royal Navy, facing a formidable enemy in the form of the German U-boats, turned to innovation as a critical tool in its defense strategy. One of the most important technological developments was radar, which allowed British ships to detect surface targets at night or in poor visibility. The development of radar equipped the Royal Navy with a vital advantage, enabling destroyers and escorts to track enemy U-boats from greater distances. However, the real game-changer was sonar, or ASDIC, Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee. Sonar allowed British ships to detect the submerged U-boats, even when they were out of sight and in the depths. This innovation, though rudimentary compared to later developments, gave the Royal Navy the ability to track and engage U-boats more effectively than ever before. ASDIC was not perfect, and it had limitations, but it was the key to preventing German submarines from lurking undetected beneath the surface. As British scientists and engineers honed these technologies, naval tactics also evolved. Convoy escorts, now equipped with sonar and radar, would hunt down U-boats using these tools, employing careful coordination to drop depth charges at precise locations. As the war progressed, these technological advancements would evolve, improving the Royal Navy's ability to identify and neutralize German submarines. This technological leap, driven by necessity and innovation, turned the tide in Britain's favor during the Battle of the Atlantic. While technology played a crucial role in the Battle of the Atlantic, the success of the Royal Navy in combating the U-boat threat ultimately came down to the bravery, leadership, and morale of its sailors. In the face of overwhelming odds and an enemy that seemed invisible and unstoppable, the men of the British Navy showed incredible resilience. They had no choice but to rise to the occasion. On the front lines were the destroyer commanders, officers who were responsible for hunting down U-boats while ensuring the safety of the convoys they were protecting. These officers exhibited a level of leadership that was critical to the success of Britain's anti-submarine efforts. Their ability to make split-second decisions, lead their crews under pressure, and coordinate complex attacks on enemy submarines became one of the key factors in the success of the British war effort. Equally vital was the morale of the sailors themselves. The Battle of the Atlantic was a long, grueling conflict, with no quick resolution in sight. The men in the Royal Navy faced long hours, constant danger, and the knowledge that each mission could be their last. Yet, despite the fatigue and mounting losses, they fought on with unwavering determination. Their bravery was matched only by their commitment to the safety of their comrades and the survival of Britain. These sailors knew the stakes of their fight and embraced their mission with courage and conviction, even as the war dragged on. By 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic was at a critical juncture. The U-boats, which had wreaked havoc on Allied shipping for years, had succeeded in crippling Britain's supply lines. The Royal Navy, with its convoys and anti-submarine tactics, had managed to hold their ground, but the U-boat fleet remained a powerful threat. Every U-boat destroyed was quickly replaced by more, and German commanders were confident in their ability to continue the pressure. Yet, beneath the waves, there was growing desperation. On a quiet morning in the North Atlantic, a British destroyer engaged a German U-boat that had been attacking a convoy. The U-boat, like many before it, the U-boat's hull buckled under the pressure, its engines sputtered to a halt, and the crew, trapped within the depths of the submarine, realized their fate was sealed. The attack, swift and merciless, was meant to sink the U-boat and its crew without hesitation. But in this instance, something extraordinary happened. As the British sailors prepared to launch another depth charge, something changed. The captain of the destroyer, realizing that the German submarine was now disabled and sinking, made an uncharacteristic decision. Instead of finishing the attack, he signaled for the U-boat crew to be rescued. In a rare act of mercy, the destroyer moved closer to the sinking vessel, offering a lifeline to those who had spent the entire war hunting British sailors. The German crew, their lives hanging by a thread, were initially stunned. The men who had spent countless hours below the waves in constant pursuit of destruction now found themselves at the mercy of their enemies. The radio crackled with confusion as the British sailors reached out. The act of kindness in the midst of relentless warfare was incomprehensible to the U-boat crew. This was no ordinary battle. This was a moment that would forever change how they saw their captors, and, in some way, how the world would view the morality of warfare. In the moments following the British decision to rescue the German crew, the U-boat sailors, once hunters, found themselves not in a prison, but in the unexpected hands of mercy. As the German sailors were brought aboard the British destroyer, they were greeted with a level of care and dignity they had never expected from their enemies. The British sailors, exhausted from their own efforts, but resolute in their duty, worked quickly to treat the German crew. There were no calls for retribution, no threats of imprisonment. The sailors, who had once fought bitterly on opposite sides of the war, now shared a quiet bond, one born of survival, not conflict. For the German sailors, the experience was a shock. They had been raised to believe that they were fighting a righteous war, one that would destroy the enemies of the Reich. They were taught that those they fought against were subhuman, to be destroyed without mercy. Yet, in their hour of need, the British sailors showed them the very humanity they had been told to extinguish. As they were provided with medical attention, food, and the chance to rest, the German crew could only wonder how they had been spared. The psychological impact on the German sailors was profound. Many had entered the war filled with a sense of duty and nationalism, believing in the superiority of their mission. But as they stood aboard the British destroyer, they saw their enemies not as faceless figures, but as human beings, acting out of compassion. The contrast between their initial expectations of brutal treatment and the kindness they received led some to reconsider the harsh ideology that had shaped their understanding of the war. This moment of humanity, in the midst of such brutal conflict, was a stark reminder of the fragile nature of human decency, even in wartime. For the British sailors, the decision to rescue the U-boat crew was not one taken lightly. They understood the consequences of their actions, the complexities of the war they were fighting, and the danger in showing mercy to their enemies. But in that moment, they chose compassion over retaliation. The decision would have long-lasting effects, not just on the lives of the rescued sailors, but on the moral fabric of wartime conduct. This rare moment of mercy was an embodiment of British values, even in the harshest of circumstances. The impact of this rare act of mercy reverberated through the German U-boat crews and beyond, shaping the way those who survived would view the conflict. For the rescued U-boat sailors, the experience was nothing short of transformative. These men, once taught to regard the British with contempt and hatred, the British sailors who had saved their lives were not the ruthless killers they had imagined, but men fighting for their country, just as they had. For many, this act of kindness sparked deep reflection. The German sailors, once eager to return to their boats and resume their role in the war, were now faced with a moral dilemma. Their captors had shown them a mercy that the crew had never expected, a reminder that even in the midst of war, human decency could prevail. For some, the experience would serve as a turning point in their perception of the war and its moral implications. The psychological effect was profound. The horror of being trapped on a sinking vessel and the subsequent rescue by their enemies left these sailors grappling with their beliefs and their roles in the war. In many cases, the rescue deepened the psychological scars of war. It was one thing to fight for your country, but it was another to have your life spared by those you had been trained to consider subhuman. Some of the German sailors would later reflect on the humanity they had encountered, shifting their views of the British and of the war itself. In the years following the war, several former U-boat sailors would recount their experiences, acknowledging the unexpected kindness they had received. Some expressed gratitude. The decision to spare their lives left them with a sense of moral ambiguity that stayed with them long after the war ended. The story of the rescue also had a significant impact on British naval tactics and the approach to dealing with prisoners of war. Although mercy in the heat of battle was rare, the decision to save the U-boat crew illustrated an important aspect of British naval conduct, a balance between the harsh realities of warfare and the moral conduct expected of those involved. For the British sailors, this decision was not simply one of mercy. For the Royal Navy, the decision to spare German lives, though rare, reinforced a wider commitment to the principles of international law, including the treatment of prisoners of war. While the immediate focus of the British Naval Command was winning the Battle of the Atlantic, the treatment of prisoners was also carefully considered. Many British sailors adhered to the idea that their moral integrity would be vital in the war, even when fighting the most ruthless of enemies. This event became part of the broader British narrative during the war, a story of resilience, decency, and the refusal to sink to the level of the enemy. The actions of the British destroyer crew were consistent with the principles set out in the Geneva Conventions, even though the realities of war often meant those principles were difficult to uphold. In this particular instance, the British acted not simply as soldiers, but as human beings, offering life when many would have offered death. As the war went on, this incident also sparked debates within military circles about the nature of warfare and the conduct of soldiers in extreme circumstances. While it remained rare for prisoners to be treated with such mercy, the event left an indelible mark on British naval culture. It became a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, there were moments where compassion could still prevail over cruelty. The Battle of the Atlantic, in all its brutal intensity, the rare act of mercy shown to the German U-boat crew, an act that defied the brutal conventions of total warfare, became a poignant symbol of British values during the conflict. It illustrated that, even in the most dire of circumstances, compassion could endure, shaping how Britain and the Allies were perceived in the years following the war. The event highlighted a key difference between the British and their enemies. Where the German military sought to impose a brutal and unrelenting vision of power, the British, even in war, demonstrated a commitment to human decency. This act of mercy stood in stark contrast to the inhumane treatment that many Allied POWs suffered under Nazi and Japanese forces. It reinforced Britain's belief in the importance of adhering to moral principles, even when confronted by the very real horrors of war. This incident had a significant effect on how the British Navy approached its post-war legacy. The idea of showing compassion during wartime, particularly to prisoners, remained a point of pride for many in Britain. Even during the darkest days of the war, when survival seemed to depend on ruthlessness, the British sailors' decision to offer mercy became an enduring example of their sense of humanity. It was a reminder that, even in a conflict as total and destructive as World War II, the core values of respect, dignity, and human life could still hold weight. The decision was seen as a reflection of Britain's character and resolve, a nation that fought not only for survival, but for the preservation of its moral standing in the world. As Britain's empire receded and the world emerged from the war, this act of mercy remained a symbol of the strength that Britain drew not only from its military power, but from its unwavering commitment to compassion. For the surviving German sailors, the memory of their rescue by British forces stayed with them. Many would later reflect on the strange and humbling encounter and the gesture of mercy that defied their expectations of what wartime conduct should have been. It became a story they would tell, one of survival, of the brutality of war, and of an unexpected moment when the rules of combat were briefly suspended in favor of something greater: humanity. The story of mercy shown to the German U-boat crew amid the unforgiving depths of the Atlantic is one of the great moral paradoxes of World War II. In a conflict defined by mass destruction and relentless violence, this rare act of compassion stands as a reminder that even in the most savage of wars, moments of humanity can prevail. It is a story that transcends nationalities, revealing the complex nature of warfare and the choices that individuals must make when confronted with the unimaginable. For the British sailors, the decision to rescue their enemies, rather than finish them off with another depth charge, was not one born of weakness. It was a calculated, deliberate act that aligned with the values they upheld. This act became a symbol of British resolve. Trapped in their own war, were confronted with the humbling reality that their enemies, once seen only as the source of death and destruction, had offered them life instead. This moment, so brief, yet so profound, changed the way they viewed the war, their captors, and the very notion of what it meant to be human. In the years after the war, the story of the rescue was a testament to what could be achieved when compassion triumphed over hatred. It is a reminder that while war can strip away many things, lives, resources, ideals, it cannot take away the power to choose, to show mercy, and to rise above the brutal forces that seek to define us. In the midst of a war that would claim millions of lives, this single act of humanity stood as a beacon of hope, reminding the world of the light that still exists, even in the darkest times.